Everyone. I'm Andy Shapiro. I'm the chair of the board of the Václav Havel Center. I want to wish you all a happy May Day. So when we first planned this event many months ago to have Anne Applebaum and John Shattuck present with us, we thought she'd be talking about the situation elsewhere in the world. And I confess that I had been definitely on one side of the bell curve in the don't be alarmist camp, even as recently as November and December. It's not going to get as bad as people think. Everybody calm down. So many things have occurred that were not on my bingo card back before the inauguration. Not on my bingo card was shipping people down to a foreign gulag without hearings based on tattoos, arresting judges in courthouses, targeting the media, universities, law firms, and having all those institutional players display what Tim Snyder called anticipatory obedience. Yes. None of that was expected by me, at least, and none of it is business as usual. Speaking of business, also not on my radar at the time was having a chief executive who also is running a crypto exchange, has a meme coin, a media stock of sorts through which foreign governments or anyone who wants a favor can put money into his pocket. But there have been people who are less optimistic than I am who had been warning about this for a while. And I think of some of these voices. I think of Gary Kasparov's book, Winter is Coming, Madeleine Albright, Fascism, A Warning, Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. I mentioned Tim Snyder earlier, The Road to Unfreedom. In that group of prophetic voices, and here I mean prophetic in the original sense of people warning of disaster, I think, I would place Anne Applebaum, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing actually since we were both in college, when she was the managing editor at Yale of something called the New Journal, which is a terrific publication, or was a terrific publication. And even then, it was plain that she had a sophisticated and mature and realistic view of the world that many of us did not have. Her article in The Atlantic, The Bad Guys Are Winning, was a prophetic statement that has been turned into her most recent book. And it can be easy to despair in times like this. But let's think about where we are right now. We're here at the home of the Václav Havel Center. As you can see from this lovely poster over here, our mission is to promote democratic freedoms, universal human rights, and the power of the arts to uplift and transform our lives in the spirit of Václav Havel. And if we are feeling a little bit down, and I know Ambassador Shattuck is going to talk about this a little more, but you can think about Václav Havel, who certainly, I think, had more reason to despair or be dubious about the ability to change things and to resist the forces of authoritarianism and dictatorship than we do now. But he persevered, and we will as well. I want to say one or two words about my friend John Shattuck. He was the ambassador to the Czech Republic in the second Clinton administration. He was my predecessor there. I had the good fortune to be there in the second Obama administration. He's always been a very helpful guide, and he is a wise and insightful observer of the world. He went to Yale College. He studied at Clare College, Cambridge, then at Yale Law School, and went on, after working at the ACLU for a time, to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. If there's still an Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, it won't be long before it's gone, I'm sure. Let me know. But in that capacity, he worked closely with another great friend of Havel and of the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. on issues ranging from the genocide in Rwanda to the conflict in Bosnia. He was in the Czech Republic at the time that the country was moving into NATO. He then went on to become the rector of the Central European University, a tremendous institution which was based in Budapest, and which gave him a position which gave him first-hand experience of creeping authoritarianism, because Viktor Orban and Hungary made it more and more difficult for the CEU to do its job while he was there. He's now affiliated with the Fletcher School at Tufts and with the Kennedy School at Harvard, and he's most recently the author of Holding Together, Hijacking Rights in America and How to Reclaim Them for Everyone. So Ambassador Shattuck will be introducing Anne, and we'll be participating in a little question and answer with her. But before we go to that, we have a special video welcome from the new executive director of our partner organization in Prague, the Václav Havel Library in Prague, Tomáš Sedláček, and he wanted to say a few words. It's 2 a.m. there, so we're not doing this live, it's by video. Let's see if I can operate this. One, two, there we go. And fine looking fellow. Jana, do I push this one more time? Where is Jana? All right.
It is my great pleasure to extend warm greetings from springy Prague to New York, 2 free cities, and it is doubly my pleasure as the new director of Václav Havel Library to extend congratulations to Anne for such a timely book. I don't know how you did it, but there could not have been a more timely topic to be studying right now. Why am I saying this? Because we have seen similar developments in this beautiful country, which was once under a heavy totalitarian regime for 40 years. And we've seen our neighbors going through similar processes in East and in South. And it seems to me that something remotely similar is perhaps taking place in the most free country of the world, which is the United States of America. So I would like to perhaps wish you, in the legacy of Václav Havel, that you will be able to stand strong as leaders of the free world and be sure to make a lot of room for public, democratic, open, critical debate. This is something that we have been deprived of, and as Anne Applebaum writes very nicely in her book, quoting Václav Havel, it begins always very silently, and the first step that happens is hard to notice, but it is the elites of every thinkable area, not just intellectuals, but also carpenters and car repairers. Every area has an elite, and these elites are smeared first. So I would just like to wish you a lot of strength. I wish you that the American civic society, which defends liberalism and freedom, will be summoned. We have ours always sort of on standby because of our historic reasons. Our country has fallen to this at least twice in our recent history. And we are ready, sort of seeing the smallest whims of autocracy appearing. You in the United States, on the contrary, luckily have never been perhaps exposed to this. And perhaps now is the time to gather something that we have had here on standby in the last decades. So my question is, are you worried that something that you are describing in your book is actually happening in front of our very eyes? And to what degree is Václav Havel, whom you quote very nicely in your book, inspirational in the light of recent events? It is again my great pleasure to be present, at least in this form, and I hope that in the future we'll have many similar debates, being able to protect freedoms of courts, freedoms of expression, freedoms of opinion, and most importantly, make sure that the continent of Europe and the continent of Northern America does not bifurcate. We thinkers who have long-term prosperity of our continents on our hearts should make sure that politics does not disturb this in the short term. All the best and best of luck.
Well, I feel that this is approaching almost a teach-in. It's very exciting to be here with all of you on this this momentous occasion, and especially given our speaker, who I will introduce in just a moment. I think it's widely recognized, as Andy has just done, and Tomasz from Prague, that we are now in the biggest political crisis of our lifetime. It is not a short-term crisis. It is a crisis of democracy under attack and authoritarianism on the rise. And this crisis is different, I think, from earlier ones. And we're going to explore this, earlier political catastrophes. For example, the decades of communist oppression in Central and Eastern Europe, which Václav Havel and probably some of you in this audience lived through. Now, we're very fortunate that our speaker tonight is indeed one of the foremost experts on the authoritarianism of today. And let me, in introducing her, turn to Havel himself. I can't imagine anyone more eloquent than he to make this introduction. As we all know, Havel knew that people felt powerless in the face of rising authoritarianism, paralyzed often by the fear of retaliation, the proliferation of lies, and the weight of propaganda. But Havel also knew, and this is the good news, I think, and it's a good news that we need to bring from him, that the powerless had more power than many of them realized at the time. And in his most famous book, The Power of the Powerless, which we all know, he tells the story of a greengrocer who, out of fear and habit, displays every day in his shop window a government placard with a slogan that he secretly detests, and the placard says, "Workers of the world unite." And one day, the greengrocer sees that a similar sign has actually been taken out of his neighbor's shop. And he decides to take the placard down himself. And when the greengrocer and his neighbor make that decision, the regime's control begins to erode, not through revolution, but through an act of courage and resistance that inspires others to do the same thing. So that is really Havel's message to us, and he writes that the power of the powerless makes the influence felt by being true to itself, and it can issue forth in a political act, in a social movement, in a conflict inside an apparently monolithic structure, or ultimately in a transformation of the political climate. And if he were with us today, I think Havel might point to the resistance of a civil society activist who organizes a demonstration, or a government worker, or a federal judge, or a university president as the modern equivalent of the greengrocer. So drawing on Havel's words and recognizing above all that we need to understand the crisis that we're in order to learn how to resist, it's a truly great privilege to introduce Anne Applebaum. As you've heard, Anne is a prize-winning historian, a staff writer for The Atlantic, and a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University Agora Institute. Her widely celebrated books include Gulag, A History, which won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, which received the Gelber and Cooper Prizes in 2017 and 18, and Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, which was a National Book Award finalist in 2012. These books have appeared in more than 24 translations in all major European languages. Her latest books are the New York Times bestsellers, Twilight of Democracy and Autocracy Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. She's lectured widely at Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, Oxford, Cambridge, London, and universities throughout Europe. She was a Washington Post columnist for 15 years and a member of the Post editorial board, and earlier she was deputy editor of The Spectator and a columnist for several British newspapers. So please join me in welcoming Anne Applebaum as our inaugural Václav Havel lecturer. Anne?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I won't begin with the parable of the greengrocer, but I'll end with it. So we'll return to Havel at the end. I thought I would take a little bit of time this evening to discuss what we mean by autocracy, because what Havel lived through in the world that he was describing and writing about in the 1970s and the 1980s is a little bit different from the world that we're living in now. And I thought I would begin with that, and then maybe we'll move to the present. You know, all of us have in our minds a cartoon image of what an autocratic state looks like. We think there's a bad man at the top, and he controls the police, and the police, maybe they threaten people with violence, and there are evil collaborators and maybe some brave dissidents. But in the 21st century, that cartoon bears very little resemblance to reality, because nowadays autocracies are not run by one bad guy, but by quite sophisticated networks composed of kleptocratic financial structures, security services, military, police, paramilitary groups, surveillance technology, and professional propagandists. And the members of these networks are connected not only within a given country, but among many countries. So the corrupt state-controlled companies in one dictatorship do business with the corrupt state-controlled companies in another dictatorship, and the police in one country can arm and equip and train the police in another, and the propagandists can share resources. You know, the troll farms that promote one dictator's propaganda can be used, you know, we've even seen it happen, can be turned very abruptly to support another. And they use the same themes. You know, they pound home the same messages about the weakness or the degeneracy of democracy and the superiority of their own states. To be clear, that this is not to say that there's some kind of super secret room like in a James Bond movie where bad guys all meet, and nor is it the case that they have a unifying ideology. So among modern autocrats, there are people who call themselves communists, there are people who call themselves nationalists, there are theocrats, Putinism and Chavismo and North Korean Juche and the Islamic Republic and Chinese communism. They all have very different historical roots and different aesthetics. And they don't have a leader either. Washington has always liked to talk about Chinese influence, but actually what really links the members of this club is a common desire to preserve and enhance their personal power and especially their wealth. And towards that end, they share a common loathing of independent courts and media, of all checks and balances, of a legitimate opposition. They hate transparency, they hate accountability, and they prefer secrecy and obfuscation. So they have something in common with the old Soviet bloc, but there are some new elements as well. The Soviet dictatorship and the communist dictators of Central Europe were not billionaires. Putin is a billionaire, Xi is a billionaire. Most of the other leaders of most other autocracies are billionaires. Their interest in money is now a very important part of who they are. and their interest in maintaining secrecy and opacity around that money is also part of what they need to do to stay in power. And when they are pushing back against democratic narratives and against the ideas of government accountability, that's part of why. So unlike military or political alliances from other times and places, the members of this group don't operate like a bloc. But more like an agglomeration of companies. And that was how I got the title for my book, Autocracy Inc., Autocracy Incorporated. And so their links are cemented not by ideals, not by some kind of ideology, but by deals, literally. Deals that are designed to take the edge off Western economic boycotts or to make them personally rich. And that's why they can operate so easily across ideological and geographical and historical lines. I'll give you a couple of examples of how this works. So here's one. I think there's some Venezuelans here tonight, so I'll use Venezuela. Venezuela is an international pariah. So since 2008, the EU and Canada and the US have all had sanctions on Venezuela. It's very difficult for Venezuela to trade with anybody. Theoretically, Venezuela is isolated. It has no contact with the outside world. But in practice, it does. Nicolas Maduro's regime receives loans as well as oil investment from Russia. Turkey facilitates the illicit Venezuelan gold trade. Cuba has long provided security advisors and security technology to the Venezuelan leadership. The Venezuelans use online surveillance technology and apps that help control people that come from China. The international narcotics trade keeps individual members of the regime well supplied with designer handbags. Even Iran, which is a country sort of almost as far away from Venezuela geographically and historically and ideologically as you can imagine a country to be, has a deep and interlocked relationship with the Venezuelan regime. They sell oil technology to the Venezuelans. They've helped them enter the world of illicit black market trading. In return, the Venezuelans have, among other things, given visas and helped facilitate the travel of Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies around the world. So there's a relationship between two countries that don't have any ties except that they share this sense of outsiderness and this desire to break the law. Leopoldo Lopez, who's a former mayor of Caracas, who now lives in exile in Spain, has famously once observed that Maduro talks a lot about the supposed help that the Venezuelan opposition gets from Americans, but it's really nothing comparable, doesn't compare in any way to what Maduro himself has received from the autocratic world. So the autocratic world helps keep that regime in power. And to be clear, Venezuelan opposition has charismatic leaders. They have dedicated grassroots activists who have persuaded millions of people to go out on the streets. Venezuela had an election a few months ago. The opposition, not only did the opposition win, it was able to prove that it won. They collected the tallies from voting booths around the country. They demonstrated their victory, and yet they did not manage to achieve a change in power. And that's because the people of Venezuela aren't fighting their own regime. They're also, in fact, fighting multiple autocrats in multiple countries. And above all, they're fighting people who have inured themselves to the feelings of their countrymen, as well as the feelings and opinions of everybody else, because Autocracy Inc. doesn't give just money and security to its members, but also something that's less tangible and just as important, which is the sense of impunity. They don't feel they're obliged or beholden to anybody. So they're impervious to international criticism. They feel no shame about the use of open brutality. And this has been most dramatically shown in Russia. Russian troops don't bother to hide the torture chambers they've built in occupied Ukrainian territory or the mass graves they've created. When they invaded Ukraine, in 2022, part of the purpose was to demonstrate the world that they don't care about the laws of war. They don't care about the UN Charter and its rules about borders. They're not interested in any form of international law. They don't care about the norms of Europe. The idea that since World War II, we don't change borders in Europe by force. But they're not alone. I mean, the Burmese junta is unashamed to murder hundreds of protesters, including young teenagers, on the streets of Rangoon. The Chinese government boasted about its destruction of the popular democracy movement in Hong Kong. This is an open display of contempt for any form of opposition to their regime that is also a little bit different from the Soviet, from the Cold War era, rather. So the Soviet Union was interested in how it was perceived in the world and would bend over backwards to demonstrate falsely at the UN and other places that it was a law-abiding state. This layer of hypocrisy, if you will, is now gone. At the extremes, this kind of contempt can even devolve into what a friend of mine, Srđan Popović, who's a democracy activist, started in Serbia, what he calls the Maduro model of governance, just to use Venezuela again. And what he said is that autocrats who adopt it are willing to see their country enter the category of failed states. So they will accept economic collapse, isolation, and mass poverty, just as Venezuela has, if that's what it takes to stay in power. I mean, that was the model that Assad had applied in Syria. It's what Lukashenko is preparing in Belarus. It's what the Taliban leadership had in mind when they occupied Kabul, and it may be where Putin is taking Russia. So their goal, when they think about their countries, is not to create prosperity or well-being. Their goal is to enrich themselves and their families and to stay in charge. Now, and this is where the story gets a little bit closer to home, because how is it that, I'll start with how is it they've achieved so much impunity? Well, part of it is that they persuaded for a long time so many people in other parts of the world to go along with them. Let me just go back for a moment in time and tell you that in 2015, in the spring, I helped publish a report on the Russian use of disinformation in Central and Eastern Europe. And together with a colleague, some of you might know, Edward Lucas, he lived for a long time in Prague, I took it around Washington and Capitol Hill and the State Department, and we showed it to anybody who would listen, and there was a kind of polite interest. We're very sorry that Czechs and Slovaks are having these problems, but it can't happen here in America. A few months later it did, as famously in 2016. I mean, the undeniable thing that happened in 2016 is that Russian trolls operating from St. Petersburg tried to shift the outcome and change the conversation around an American election, much as the same way they do in Central Europe, using fake Facebook pages and Twitter accounts and attempting to infiltrate groups like the NRA, sharing hacked material from the Democratic National Committee with WikiLeaks and helping turn that into dozens of conspiracy theories. And instead of rejecting this interference, and instead of pointing out that this was undemocratic or illegal, the Trump campaign famously welcomed it. And if it's what you say, I love it. Remember that? Don Trump Jr. wrote to an intermediary who he thought had access to damaging information about Hillary Clinton. But I'm actually not quoting this in a spirit of partisanship, because that response was consistent not just with his family's behavior, but his industry's behavior over the previous 2 decades. So in 2008, Trump's son told a business conference that Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. And that statement could have been made at any time by dozens of other real estate investors in New York or in London or in Vancouver, where anonymous owners of shell companies were allowed to buy apartments that could be used like Swiss bank accounts as places to hide money. And probably not that far from here, there are buildings in Manhattan where people buy apartments through shell companies that they don't live in, and the purpose of that is simply to hide money. And thousands of these kinds of purchases enriched Americans and Europeans, as well as the children of Chinese oligarchs or African oil magnates. And all of them participated in this shadow world of secret finance, which is the kind of normal milieu of Autocracy Inc. And you didn't have to be involved in real estate to be part of that world. So in truth, the list of major American and European corporations that have really quite tangled webs of connections, personal and financial and business links to China or Russia and other autocracies is very long. We all know that Russian money was able in the past to buy the services of a former German chancellor or a dinner with the British Prime Minister. We know that American or British or Dutch, accountants and lawyers have helped foreign autocrats as well as domestic business tycoons steal and hide and launder their money inside the international financial system as well. A few years ago, one of the great consortia of investigative journalists published excerpts from what were called the Pandora Papers. And this was a big cache of documents that detailed the operations of tax havens and people who keep money in them. And for me, one of the most remarkable things was how much they showed clandestine financial traffic going through Delaware and Nevada and South Dakota and Wyoming. I mean, this wasn't the Cayman Islands, it wasn't somewhere far away, somewhere with palm trees. These were nice, sort of normal American states full of nice, normal Americans, all of whom were helping nameless investors hide their money from tax authorities or maybe worse. And once you understand the scope and range of this world of secret financial operations, it becomes easier to understand why the old tools that we once used to push back against autocratic political systems have become weaker. Sanctions, for example. It's true that the application of sanctions on Russians has made it harder for some of them to ski in Zermatt, but it didn't stop Putin from killing Alexei Navalny, and it didn't stop him from invading Ukraine. Decades of US sanctions haven't changed the behavior of the Iranian regime or the Venezuelan regime, despite their indisputable economic impact. In part, this is because the autocracies help one another get around them, as I described. Iranians selling drones to Moscow, Chinese helping the Russians with components. All of those things have helped the Russian war continue. But it's also because these sanction rules have loopholes that can be got around with fake passports or the transfer of money to children or cousins. And invariably, it's been possible to find accountants and lawyers and traders from the democratic world who are willing to help them get away with it. And so they have gotten away with it in part because we helped them get away with it. This story is really partly a way of saying that some of what we're seeing in the current Trump administration, Andy referred to Trump's ownership of a crypto company that can be used in effect to pay him bribes. The conflicts of interest of somebody like Elon Musk, who has been both controlling and overseeing regulatory bodies that regulate his own companies, as well as bodies that subsidize his own companies. The number of laws that the administration has announced will not be enforced, laws on transparency, laws on Foreign Bribery Act won't be enforced anymore. All these things have a prehistory. It's not like the Trump administration emerged from nowhere in one day and began doing all this stuff that we were unaware of. There was a long backstory. There was a long moment of American and European and others working together with the autocratic world, building this world of secret finance, collaborating with one another in many different ways. And what we're now watching is simply the next chapter in that older story. In an earlier version of this speech that I might have given 6 months ago, I would now speak about how to fight this new network, and I would talk about America's role in that fight. Here's where, this is probably the biggest change that we need to acknowledge, which is that the United States is no longer, for the moment, is not going to be the leader in the fight against Autocracy Inc., neither pushing back geopolitically against the autocratic world, nor pushing back against this, as I said, the wave of financial corruption which we now have inside our own administration, nor will they be pushing back against the narratives that the autocratic world uses, the argument that democracy is weak and divided and degenerate, and autocracies are stable and safe. All those things, we won't be the leaders anymore, at least right now. That doesn't mean, though, that there is nothing that can be done. In my book, I speak a lot about coalitions. And I still think that coalitions of different kinds are how we fight back inside the United States and how we work with others around the world also to fight back. Think about the kleptocratic world and how one begins to push back against it. I mean, you would need a group of Western European states, perhaps with Canada, perhaps working with the Russian opposition who understand kleptocracy better than anyone else, perhaps working with Americans who understand and care about how the system works and how it could be changed. You could imagine a group like that. To push back in favor of, to help universities, for example, maintain their independence at a time when there's pressure. It's going to be much easier for them to work as a consortia, for there to be 30 or 40 or 50 or 80 universities working to maintain their independence, working to build their build their arguments about scientific research funding or about their own rights to free speech. Working together across political lines also is something that I hope Americans will be able to do. I live, as some of you know, I live part of the time in Poland. Poland is a country that went quite far down the road towards autocratic populism between 2015 and 2023. Many of the same things that we've seen here, that we've seen in other countries. How did it eventually end? Partly it was because of a center-left, center-right liberal coalition that was able to work together, that was able to win an election, and was able to take, achieve a transfer of power. That was, of course, there were still free elections there, and I believe there will still be free elections here. But thinking broadly about how to work together across political lines, across geographical lines, in order to have an answer to Autocracy Inc., we need to think a little bit the way they do. So they don't care about ideology. They don't. Religious leaders in Iran work very happily with atheists in Venezuela. And I think the democratic world also needs to begin thinking less about ideology and more pragmatically, what are we able to do together and how do we resist? Let me just say a final word about the greengrocer, the famous Václav Havel parable. What was the original greengrocer doing? This is the story about the man who unthinkingly puts a sign in his window that he doesn't believe in. And the sign says, workers of the world unite. And by putting that up, he was demonstrating his participation in a system that he doesn't care about. And what was Havel's solution to the greengrocer who behaved like that? The answer he had was what he called living in truth. Don't lie. Don't go along with things that you know are not true. Don't even put up the sign. So don't even make the facade. If it's not true, say so. If you don't believe it, don't do it. If you can find a way to work with other people to achieve change, do that. You don't have to concede to anything. That was Havel's message. That's how he lived his life. And I see we have a long way to go before we're communist Czechoslovakia. So I hope everybody in this room rereads Power of the Powerless and feels inspired by it, as I always have been too. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, so much. It must be so complicated to be speaking about this topic as frequently as you are, because everything is changing almost every day. That isn't to say that the themes are changing, but the realities on the ground, as you pointed out just now, 6 months ago, you were giving advice about how the U.S. could be the leader of pushing back on these new autocratic regimes. And now, indeed, we're in a position where we need to take advice. So I want to pick up on some of the very useful comments that you were making toward the end about the advice you would have for countries and for individuals within countries, and particularly for the U.S., as we now look at ways of being resistant and hopefully somewhat resilient. Now, I guess maybe we could start by just looking at the influence that Viktor Orban has had on Donald Trump. And Orban has given a lot of advice to Donald Trump, and Trump seems to be taking it. What is it that we can learn from the fact that Trump is, as part of this autocratic network that you so eloquently paint, what can we take from Trump's susceptibility and interest in Orban's model? What is it about Orban's model that's particularly attractive to a rising authoritarian in the United States?
So what's attractive about Viktor Orban, not just to Trump, but to people around Trump? Sorry, I have a terrible echo that I'm hearing. Is that
We're trying to fix
you're trying to fix it? Okay. I keep trying to sit in a different position so that I'll.
Sorry.
hearing that whine, high-pitched whine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could switch to handheld mics if you want. Anyway.
Yeah, we could use the handheld mics anyway. Yeah.
Sorry. No, so what is attractive to Trump and even more so to people around Trump, I'm not sure that Trump fully understands who Viktor Orban is or cares all that much. But people around him do understand who he is, and there have been contacts between some of his close associates and the Hungarians for some time. What they admire is the fact that Orban was a legitimate, democratically elected leader. I mean, without any question, he won a huge landslide election, actually much more definitive than our election last year. But then once in power, he used his position as a democratically elected leader to begin to take over the state, so to capture the state. And I've heard him say what he did. He does not shy about describing how it was done. He talks about first putting pressure on the media. You can't have contradictory messaging. And he did that not through censorship, but mostly through financial pressure on Hungary's newspapers and television. He put pressure on courts. He changed the way the legal system worked. He eliminated the idea of any independent prosecutor, what we would call the Department of Justice. He put pressure on the legal system. He took over the civil service and state institutions and made them, rather than having them be populated by meritocrats or by people who are loyal to the Constitution and the country, he wanted it to be populated by people who are loyal to him or to his political party. In his case, the party matters a great deal. I think less so than is the case here. And along the way, he also transformed Hungary economically. But I'll stop with the politics because, of course, it's this political transformation that is what the people around Trump admire. That he was, again, a Democrat who changed the rules and massaged the system in order to keep himself in power indefinitely. So he controlled the media, he controlled the messaging, he controlled the court system. Eventually, he controlled the economy. In his case, he was able to repeatedly change the Constitution to give himself all kinds of electoral advantages, and that kept him in power. So he never had to give up power, at least until now. What they don't like to talk about is what happened next in the Hungarian economy. And so, although Hungary was in 1990 probably the most attractive country to invest in Western Europe, in Central Europe, it was. For complicated reasons, it had already begun privatization. It was already a very attractive place to be. They'd changed some of the company law, and they had a big wave of foreign investment there in the 90s. Later, when Hungary joined the European Union, there was a second wave, as well as with some EU money. But along the way, Orban, definitively injected kleptocracy and corruption into his economy that he began slowly to undermine it and bring it down. He created a group of companies who more or less exist thanks to the largesse of the state. So they win procurement contracts or they have special relationships. The Hungarians have a name for them. It's a Hungarian acronym called the NER companies. Never mind, NER Knights.
Stands for very complicated, long Hungarian words.
Unpronounceable Hungarian word. And these companies have a kind of special status in the economy and special privileges, and partly thanks to them and partly thanks to the lack of productivity elsewhere, Hungary has sunk further and further down various rankings. So much so that depending on how you count or which precise measure you use, it's either the poorest country in the European Union, or maybe the second poorest, or sometimes the third poorest. But this is pretty remarkable. It's a remarkable testament to what damage autocratic rule can do to a democracy, and how profoundly you can undermine it. I mean, Hungary has a big problem, especially with educated people leaving the country. They have a big problem with doctors leaving the country. The healthcare system is in very poor condition. The educational system is in poor condition. To be clear, Hungary is not an autocracy like Russia. It's not. There's very little violence involved in running the system. But it shares some of the characteristics of Autocracy Inc. that I described a few minutes ago. What are its leaders interested in? They're interested in themselves. And who's the biggest beneficiary of Orban's economic decisions? It's Orban's son-in-law, who's now one of the richest people in the country. And they're more interested in that group and in their immediate friends and family than they are the prosperity of Hungary and Hungarians. And that's always the key sign. Are the leaders interested in everybody and the prosperity of the nation? Or are they interested in their clique, their friends, maybe their political party, and their family? And so that's what's frightening about the Hungarian comparison.
But it's interesting as you describe the Hungarian situation and what Orban has done very successfully over 15 years. So he's hardly flooded the zone as Trump has done here. He's done this carefully over 15 years. What I think would concern all of us who are watching what's happening in the United States is that the United States is a huge country, 30 times bigger than Hungary. It has a long history of democracy. That has made it somehow vulnerable to the kind of ideas that Orban has managed to convey to at least the intellectual base of the Trump movement. And I'm not quite sure why. And it would be a remarkable development because I don't get the impression that there are any countries that you've named among the many that you're surveying that have been captured by autocracy that have been for as long democracies as the U.S. has, or as large. So this would be a huge prize. How does this work?
No, so first of all, it's a couple of things. It's true that what's happened here in the last 3 months has been pretty unprecedented in that the speed with which they have moved is not like anything I can remember in other. If you look at Turkey, or you look at Hungary, or look at India, for example, or you look at other countries where you've had a more autocratic forms of government take over democracies or populist leaders, so-called populist autocrats. One of the things that's very different in the U.S. was the way in which Elon Musk and his team of engineers made changes not through Congress or not through legislation, as Orban did, for example, but by literally going into the Treasury Department, taking over the computer system and cutting off payments. And I'm not aware of that being done anywhere else. And so there's even a question. I mean, some of the cuts that were made, for example, to the National Endowment for Democracy, or to Radio Free Europe, which is an important, based in Prague and an important media, especially in Eastern Europe. It's not even clear that Trump himself is responsible for those cuts or knows or cares about them. So it's actually a group of people underneath him, either Musk himself or people linked to Musk, who've decided to make these cuts and these changes. It's also clear that the attempt to take over the state is right now very focused on the civil service. So Doge is creating very little efficiency and very few savings, if any savings, actually, because the cost of what they're doing, the cost of the long-term cost of breaking up USAID in the manner that they did will be very expensive in paid off contracts and lost funds and all kinds of other things. But it is very effective at undermining the civil service, making people afraid to go to work, making people want to quit. And I live in Washington part of the time, and I know many people who are, even if they're still working for the federal government, they're now hoping to leave. And so the idea is to replace the civil service with something else. So all of that's true. At the same time, the United States is a very large country. We have a federal system. There are other centers of power outside of Washington. There are state capitals. There is a judicial system that has very deep roots and a great deal of respect and a great deal of influence. And you're beginning to see already both at the state level and at the judicial level, you're beginning to see people and judges and others blocking some of these, these very often illegal changes. I mean, the Supreme Court is an interesting case. I lived part of the time in Poland, and we experienced an assault on the Polish Constitutional Tribunal, which is the rough equivalent of the Supreme Court. But the Constitutional Tribunal, first of all, it was possible to pack it, which is, I don't think it's going to be possible in our case. I mean, I don't see Trump firing all 9 judges and replacing them. That still seems hard for me to imagine. And the court has a status. I mean, the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland wasn't a beloved institution that had a deep roots in Polish history and that everybody knew the names of all the judges and could cite court cases from over 200 years of history, like people can. If you've studied American history, you know about Brown v. Board of Education or Marbury versus Madison, or a series of other important cases. So there are elements of our system that I can see are going to begin to block or even reverse changes. I mean, and of course Trump's impulse to do everything through executive orders and to do everything through avoiding Congress, and to and therefore to run American economic policy on a kind of whimsical basis. What he feels like when he gets up in the morning. Do you feel like having high tariffs or low tariffs? To use bizarre formulas to decide which tariffs we have. I mean, you can already begin to see the impact of that. I don't have to tell everybody here how that's affecting people. So, I can see how although they're moving faster, much faster than Orban ever did, they're also creating resistance, and they're also beginning to hit roadblocks. Some of which Orban was too clever was clever enough rather to avoid.
So one of the models that you've put forward in Autocracy Inc., and you mentioned again tonight, for governance as a new autocrat is the retributionist model. That is to say that where you're really going to exact a cost on your political enemies and you're going to make them pay in whatever way they have that you can. And this seems to be a pretty major theme of the Trump presidency. And one of the big questions, I guess, based on everything you've just said in terms of the size of the United States and the possibilities of various pressure points beginning to emerge, is whether people who were previously afraid are now going to start coming forward. And is Trump going to have less power to exercise exact retribution against his enemies? Take, for example, if I may, the Republicans in the Congress, particularly in the Senate, who've so far lined up in lockstep behind him.
So, I mean, one of the reasons Trump has been able to do what he's done in the last 3 months is precisely because the Republicans in the Senate and the House have decided not to oppose him, and they've decided to give up what is actually constitutionally their power to make decisions about taxes and about budgets. So tariffs are taxes, and with a stroke of the pen, they could say Trump is right now using an emergency order to justify his use of tariffs, and Congress could stop him if they wanted to. Congress also, these programs that are being cut and these civil servants who are being fired from regulatory agencies, those are all agencies and programs that Congress created. And so Congress created them, Congress funded them, and so Congress would have a right to insist that they remain. And so obviously one of the big political questions, maybe the most important political question for the next, year and a half, is will Congress begin to recover its power, and will it begin to play the role of checking and balancing the president that the Constitution mandates it to do? And that actually by itself would restore us to some kind of equilibrium. And then just, Trump's personality wouldn't change, or his desire to get back at his enemies, or his, whimsical attitude to tariffs. But there would be, another constitutional body that would be in a better position to check and control him. When and why and how that might happen, obviously, I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing that, particularly the House, where people face re-election, in how many months is it? 18 months.
18 months.
18 months.
Yeah.
That they might, 6 months from now or 8 months from now, might begin to worry. That the president's actions will affect their political careers. So, I mean, that's how the system is supposed to work, and that would be the most important change.
In a few minutes, and prepare yourselves. I'll go out to the audience for questions. So think of any that you may have for Anne. But let me pursue another line with you first, Anne. Before we do that. One of the fascinating aspects of your work is and I don't know any other person studying authoritarianism and autocracy today who's showing this network of connections among the various autocrats. You referred to this frequently in your remarks. The network, I think, from the point of view of the United States, it's most interesting, is essentially a network of enemies of the United States, Putin at the top of the list, perhaps, and maybe others with whom Trump is fascinated, about whom he's fascinated, who otherwise are acting very much against the interests of the United States. But let's take Putin alone. How do you go about analyzing the relationship between Putin and Trump? Is it simply two autocrats who kind of admire each other, or is there more to it than that?
So this reminds me of, there was a wonderful moment when Pope John Paul II died, and Larry King was on television, and he had two priests at his table, and he said to them, "Do you think he's with Jesus? You have 30 seconds." So it's like, I don't know, how much time do you have to answer that question?
Right, that's good.
So it's not an easy question to answer briefly. Clearly, Trump has had an obsession with an interest in Russia that goes back to the 1980s. In 1987, he took out these 3 full-page ads in American newspapers, calling on, he took a trip to Moscow, he came back, he took out these ads, and in the ads, the ads were about the U.S. wasting money on allies. So this is a familiar theme. So he's been talking about alliances being a drag, the democratic world being a problem for America. He's been talking about these things for 30, 40 years. So this is not new. His interest in Russia, in doing business with Russia, is also long-standing and very old. We know His sons have told us, and we know from other sources, that many of the investments in Trump buildings and condos were via shell companies at a time when the shell companies were very often Russian. So he had a lot of Russian money went into his real estate business. There were a couple of big transactions with Russian oligarchs as well that have been, all of this has been extensively written about. We know that in the 2016 election, the Russians really bent over backwards to try to get him elected. I mean, I won't relitigate that or argue about why they thought they were doing it or how effective it was. I mean, it's clear that Trump wanted them to do that. People around him were happy about that. In my mind, I don't care whether you could legally call it collusion or not collusion, but it happened and they were not unhappy. And so there is a long relationship that goes back many years. It may have a financial component in that Trump may feel that the Russians helped him in the past and he owes them something. I mean, this is me speculating. It may have a psychological component. Trump also would like to be like Putin. He would like to rule without checks and balances, without judges, without courts, without the rule of law, without the press. He admires that kind of political system and he would like to emulate it. And he sees Putin as somebody who's strong, who doesn't have to listen to anybody else. He seems to see Xi the same way, actually, and maybe even Kim Jong-un, who he enjoyed meeting so much in his first term. He does have and frequently expresses open admiration for that kind of leader. And so all of those instincts are on the surface. I mean, you don't need a secret explanation to see any of that. You don't need there to be hidden stories or for him to be an agent or anything like that. He has had an economic relationship with Russia, an affinity with Russia, and an admiration for the brutality and the autocracy of Russia for many years, and he's been telling us that. It's not a secret. It's not something that's hidden. I mean, the strange thing is, of course, as your question implies, Russia is, to say that Russia is our enemy isn't just a kind of, rhetorical thing to say. So the Russians carry out regular cyber attacks on the United States. The Russians have, are looking to acts of murder and sabotage they carry out in the United States, sometimes against their own citizens, sometimes against others, but also all across Western Europe, in countries that are allied to us. There's a big problem with Russian ships cutting cables in the Baltic Sea. There are, as I said, repeated examples of cyber attacks, arson, many other things. The Russian attack on Ukraine, both the original one in 2014 and now the full-scale war of 2022, is a direct threat with countries who are closely allied to us, who are our close economic partners, who we've been working with for many years. The fact is that so to say that Russia is an enemy is not it's not just a way of talking. I mean, Russia is a cause of creates financial and military and security and other forms of strain for us and for countries that we've long worked with. The fact is that Trump is not bothered by any of that.
That's the most both damning and fascinating aspect of the analysis, not just yours, but many others are making that analysis, because it does seem, and we don't need to pursue this too far, but it does seem that almost everything that Trump is doing vis-a-vis Putin is really to try to attack American democracy and have Putin as his ally in doing that. We have words that describe this in the law. I'm not sure I want to pronounce one, but the one word is treason. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's treasonous behavior at this moment, but on the other hand, if you're acting consistently against the interests of your own country in working with another country which is also acting against your interests, it gets problematic.
No, I don't disagree at all. From his point of view, his interests are American interests. So what he wants to do, this is how he understands the role of the president. This is not what it says in our Constitution. This is not how the founding fathers conceived the presidency, or really how anybody prior to him conceived the presidency. Certainly not in contemporary times. But he conceives the presidency a little bit like a monarchy. I am this, I am the state. What I decide is American policy, and therefore it's good for America. So I'm not sure that he would make that distinction in his mind. And he now, unlike in his first term, when he was surrounded by people who did understand what were America's interests and what are American security interests, he is now surrounded by people who are willing to go along with whatever he says.
Yes.
That's the big difference between this Trump term and the previous one. It is exactly, I wrote about this in, The Atlantic had a cover story, which was actually just a list of things we thought Trump might do, published in 2024, and I wrote the piece about NATO, and it more or less described what's happening now, that he might seek to undermine NATO, not necessarily through some grand act, he's stomping out of the room or ripping up the treaty, but simply by undermining the credibility of the alliance. That's what he's instinctively always wanted to do, as I said, since the 1980s.
Well, of course, taking a very large perspective, the world is fundamentally changing. It was changing even before Trump. The old, sort of post-Cold War international order was crumbling, et cetera. So all of this, Trump getting factored into that means to some extent that he's an amanuensis for that, I suppose. I'm sorry, I'm monopolizing you here. I'm going to ask anybody in the audience who has a question. I'm sure we have several. So we don't have much time. What do we have? Where's Yana? How much time do we have?
Maybe 3 questions?
3 questions, yes. Okay. Let's go right here first.
Sorry.
Sir, right in front of me. Yeah, in the second row.
Hi. Great talk, by the way. So you've pointed out that the reason Trump has been able to accomplish what he has in the last 3 months is because he has a compliant Congress. And the reason they're compliant, I think everybody knows, is because of fear. And we've talked a lot about political fear, primaries, but there's also the prospect of violence.
Yes.
And we haven't really seen that yet. I'm just wondering what your view is on whether that's a real threat, because there is a MAGA base out there that is well armed and ready to come to the defense of their president. And I wonder what your view of that is.
So we know that Republican senators, for example, are afraid of personal violence because some of them have said so. Lisa Murkowski said so a few days ago. There's also a scene in, a colleague of mine, Mackay Coppins, wrote a biography of Mitt Romney, which I recommend. And there's a scene in there towards the end where Romney describes a conversation he had with a Senate colleague right after the impeachment vote. And the colleague said, well, it's all very well for you. He was trying to convince him to vote for impeachment, and the colleague said, it's very well for you to vote for impeachment because, you're wealthy and you can pay for private security. But if I go home to my state, I don't have that. And so we know that there is, among people who come from red states, that there is a lot of fear that if they go against Trump, they'll suffer either politically or in person. And of course, there have been small episodes of threats and political violence. I mean, for example, to people, Arizona election officials, the journalists in places like Tennessee who I've met and spoken to. So we know that it exists so far on a low level. So it's definitely a real threat. It's not completely unique in American history to have violence in politics. I mean, there was violence kept black people from voting in the South for many, many decades. If you look back at the history of the 19th century, there's a lot of political violence. So it's not that it's never happened. 1960s actually is a bit more recent. This feels a little bit different because it's so focused on making one political party behave in a particular way. Again, the only the only solution to it has to be a group solution. I mean, there will only be a change when, either all of them or some significant group of Republicans in the Senate decide to work together and decide to find a way to change things. I mean, as I said, it's the same solution for universities. It's the same solution for businesses and for many others.
So let's take two more, and we might take them together if we could. Just one here and one over there, so we get on this side of the room. Thank you. If you could just do them one after the other.
Thank you. Can you comment on the attack of the federal government on science, and particularly on the STEM fields? And because these fields are by their nature unpolitical, and I don't think it was anything anyone had predicted, and it's not necessarily typical for autocracies elsewhere. And so how does this fit in?
So you said attack on science, and I didn't hear what the second attack on.
On the STEM fields, medicine and STEM, science, technology.
STEM.
STEM.
Yeah.
I heard stamp, and I was like, what is that? Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, is there something wrong with the post office? Stamp.
Should we get one more, and then you can do them together? There was one over here. Oh, all right. Okay.
I'm afraid there were a lot of questions.
All right.
Predictably.
Sorry.
You have to have one woman, I'm sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, we should
could have four,
probably
but-
balance it out then. There were probably half a dozen key points that laid the ground for the Trumpification of America. And I want to just ask you about one of them, which is really the flip side of the autocracy in coin, oligarchy as a political party. Because we allowed so many oligarchies, very, very powerful, wealthy people to emerge in this country with direct control over more than simply the business they ran. How does that get rolled back? And is that rolling that back a prerequisite to rolling back this Trumpism?
Those are both really good questions. Sorry?
Yeah. We'll get one more. Yeah, if we could. All right, Ellen, you go ahead. Yeah. Sorry, Anne. We're just trying.
So the attack on science is really, I agree that it's extraordinary. It's not unprecedented in the history of dictatorships for them to attack science. I mean, that was a Stalin specialty as well. But certainly, it's, for example, very different from what you see in China, where they're putting a lot of money into science, or even Russia. So that is unique. In this case, it seems to me connected to two things. One is one of the things that brought Trump back to the Oval Office was a wave of science and health conspiracy thinking behind RFK Jr., behind others that were part of the if you would call it the sort of coalition that brought him back, and he is surrounded by people who dislike and have disdain for science, starting with RFK, but all the people who he's populating HHS with, and it's partly a reflection of that. This is a conspiratorial world. They don't believe science. RFK said yesterday, I think he thinks every American mother should do her own research and decide whether or not her child should have vaccines. And so that's part of the explanation. Another part of it is also, I think, they seem very determined to remove the power and prestige of American universities. And what are American universities if not, the primary vehicles for science on the planet, really? If you look at an American, and the main tool they have to control American universities is the really big money for universities that comes from the federal government is all about science. It's not the English department, or I don't know, or the gender studies department. That's nothing. What the real money is, biomedical research, the physics labs, all that's a lot of money. There's a lot of federal money that goes to it. And that's what Harvard was getting, or MIT, or Johns Hopkins, or Stanford, or indeed the University of Alabama, which has a really big and important medical school, largest employer in the city of Birmingham. So all those universities, if they want to control them, this is the tool that they're going to use to do it. So I think those are the two explanations. But I agree, it's once again, it's an incredible example of self-damage. The stock, the damage that they're doing to the stock market, like we can see it, or to the economy rather, we can measure it on the stock ticker. The damage that they're doing to the long-term prospects of the American economy by undermining science, we can't see it. There's no measure published in the Financial Times every day. We can't see it yet. But yeah, I'm afraid that we will. That's my best guess. The other question was about oligarchy. No, I mean, that's partly what I was talking about. We allowed the flourishing of a lot of secrecy, a lot of ways of people hiding money. We did also allow a few people and companies to become disproportionately wealthy. And in some cases, those are people and companies who control the information space. There was no attempt made. I want to draw. I mean, I'm not bothered by some people being wealthy, and I'm not bothered by economic competition. But the extreme that developed, I mean, in almost any society in human history where you see that kind of gap between what ordinary people can earn and what a few very wealthy can earn, that it has to have a bad effect on. It's not necessarily a bad effect on the economy, but on the way the society functions, because there's so much power in the hands of very few people. But in addition to that, the real refusal, and this is not just American, but it's in European as well, the refusal to really contemplate any kind of sensible regulation of the online world, by which I do not mean censorship. I mean allowing people control of their data, having insight and transparency around algorithms, asking whether we need these algorithms. I mean, there are many creative ways to think about how we could communicate better, how the internet could be a better, could contribute to democracy instead of undermining it, which many people believe that it would, not even that long ago, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And the fact that we haven't been able to do it, and that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans were able to do it, is partly because of the outsized influence of this very few people and companies. And so yeah, I think you're right that that precedes Trumpism, and it's part of the explanation for it.
Well, Anne, thank you so much.
One more question.
All right, I'm told there's another. Well, there's one in the back and one over here.
No, there was one woman who has a microphone.
All right. Well, Yana is.
No, just
Yana
one.
has.
No, she's got it.
Oh, she's got it. Okay. All right. Please. Please. I can't see you, so please.
When will the Republicans accept the role of the Russians? How can they? Russia has been our enemy forever, and all of a sudden it's all right with them for Trump to have this kind of relationship with Putin. So
that's the broader question about the Republican Party. I mean, there are plenty of Republicans who understand the role of the Russians. I mean, starting with Mitch McConnell. I mean, and Lindsey Graham. I mean, so they're and who have said so, and Marco Rubio. Who have said so. On the record many times. It will just be, we're waiting for the moment when they, are able to have the courage to work together to change American foreign policy to something that's good for Americans and not just good for Trump and his family. So it's a question of when it's not that they don't know. It's just a question of when they have the courage to do something.
Well, all these issues relate. Thank you so much, and very much.